Yes, so I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Deane, who is a very prominent Conservative commentator. You can often see him on Sky News, also a very prominent Brexiteer. So Alex, thank you very much for your time. And so if this kind of conversation interests you, please do subscribe to the channel. The first thing I guess we have to start with is the current crisis. We've seen the biggest expansion in state power in the economy since the Second World War. Does that make you feel uncomfortable as a Conservative?
Yes, and as a libertarian too. But it's one of the reasons that I hope people embrace the things we're being urged to do voluntarily, so that we don't have big changes in the law in terms of what the state is empowered to do, so that the things we need to do to control the spread of the virus are done by us on a personal, human and community level, rather than being imposed on us by the state. And after it, we don't need to have the fight to repeal excessive state law, which I think we will have if people flout the recommendations being given to us in the course of this highly contagious condition and go around doing stuff anyway, which means that the state will have the reason or excuse to go about giving itself great new powers. So it does concern me, but the bigger concern for me would be even more sweeping state control, which I think is part of our responsibility as individuals, doing the right thing now to avoid.
Yeah. Well, going back to happier times, so back in December when the election result came in, and it became clear that A, Corbyn wasn't going to become Prime Minister, and B, that Brexit would be delivered. What was your reaction?
Oh, it was one of the happiest times. Not only did we see the Labour Party put to the sword for a good 5 years in British parliamentary terms, but it was the December election that sealed the deal finally on us definitely leaving the European Union. And I start to be concerned about the prospect of that not happening. That is to say, of having a huge democratic crisis in which we ignored the largest vote we ever had on anything because our elite couldn't get their act together to deliver on it in the years after it. There were really two times that I thought we might not leave the European Union. I always thought we were going to win the referendum. I'm unusual in that as one of the campaigners. There was one time before the referendum, which was when Joe Cox was tragically murdered. On that day and the day afterwards, I really thought that our campaign might be in trouble. And the second time that I thought we might fail to leave the European Union was when the Supreme Court handed down judgment in the second Gina Miller case, in Miller 2, demanding that Parliament went back from prorogation. And the reason I felt that at that time was that it seemed to me that the Supreme Court and the elite that it represents were willing to do anything. They were willing to say anything, to change the law, to say that black was white in order to get their way. And that was the second time I was really concerned. But it was the December general election result that put that to the sword and stopped their ability to stymie Brexit.
Yeah. Were you surprised as someone who, obviously when the result came in 2016, were you surprised at just how vicious the opposition continued to be? Had you kind of expected them to kind of accept the result to a greater extent than people did?
Well, it may be naive of me, but I'd rather expected people to simply accept the democratic results. And I know that there are people point to statements made by other Brexiteers around the time of the referendum. All I can say is that I absolutely would have accepted the result had we lost the campaign to leave the European Union. I was the executive director of an umbrella movement that applied to the Electoral Commission to be designated as the official campaign to leave. And we lost that campaign to vote leave. And I completely accepted the result, the umpire's verdict, and walked off the pitch. Even if you think that the umpires called it wrong, you respect the authority and you go. And I would have absolutely accepted and respected the decision of the British people if we decided to remain in the EU. I've been stunned, and not in a good way, by the approach of the Continuity Remain campaign in the 3 years after we left the EU. There's nothing wrong with people having campaigned to remain in, of course. It's a perfectly respectable and intellectually admirable position, which I happen not to share. Right? And there's nothing wrong with people saying that we should rejoin the European Union. If there were a campaign to do that, I would campaign against it, I would oppose it, but I respect it intellectually. What I cannot abide is attempts by people to stymie a decision made as a sovereign country because they think that they know better, and they perversely wrap themselves in various arguments that suggest they're defenders of democracy, terms like the people's vote and so forth, as if they are seeking to preserve democracy, rather than stymie it, rather than make a mockery of that process. So what these people simultaneously seeking to stymie the biggest vote we've ever had in the history of our country, and pretending that they care about democracy, whilst what they're doing is trying to get their way, despite the fact that they lost.
Yeah. I mean, how did the struggle affect you personally? And I've spoken to a lot of Brexiteers who are kind of surprised by the attacks on themselves over the 3 years. How was it for you?
It was horrible in some ways, of course, and I got both in my professional life and in my personal life. I will have eroded some acquaintances and lost acquaintanceships and lost some friendships, and I think that's really sad. I must say, I do not think that there has been equality of arms in this behaviour. We as Brexiteers accept that people disagree with us, and there it is. Doesn't mean that you're evil. The approach from many people on the extreme end of the Remain campaign seems to have been that if people who held views like mine weren't just wrong and weren't just stupid either, but were malign and evil and anything goes, as long as we're on this side and they're on that, anything they can say about us, anything they can say to us seems entirely warranted and justifiable in their view. And look, I'm a person like anyone else, and it has been hurtful to be on the receiving end of some of those things. It's different in the workplace to the way it is in one's personal life. Barbs hurt less in the professional life, but on the other hand, they shouldn't be offered in the professional life. We should believe in diversity of opinion in the same way that we believe in other kinds of diversity. So it's a shame to have seen it professionally and quite hurtful to see it personally.
Yeah. And kind of an ironic question for a lot of Conservatives, but do you think that Brexit owes a lot to Jeremy Corbyn?
Oh, I think Brexit owes a great deal to Corbyn, not least because he was, right up until he became leader of the Labour Party, one of the most fervent campaigners for leaving the European Union. I have spoken in debates with Jeremy Corbyn at the Cambridge Union Society on the same side, because he was a fervent Brexiteer of the left, and the organisers wanted to demonstrate that he was one of us. I mean, Corbyn and co believed, suspend for a moment what you or I might think. Their argument and their position for the left-wing case for Brexit was that the European Union is a corporatist stitch-up done in the interest of big businesses and big banks and contrary to workers' rights and unionism. And that was the traditional mainstream left-wing position for leaving the EU. They're not completely wrong, and I think that if you think about the debate about the EU being divided up into four, you got Remain on the left and Remain on the right, Leave on the left and Leave on the right. I think that Leave left box was something that we heard the least from in the entirety of the Brexit process because of our media. More than 5 million people who habitually vote Labour voted to leave the EU. Their perspective was not heard at all in the court. I mean, as a proportion of the debate, as a proportion of airtime, their position wasn't really heard in the course of the referendum. But it was a position of significant comfort to me that they were amply represented by Jeremy Corbyn leading the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn's one of us.
Yeah. I mean, do you think, so it's interesting you say that. I mean, do you think that, Vote Leave in particular is obviously quite a Tory organisation, and most of the senior figures in it had links to the Tory party. I know they tried to bring in, people from the Labour Party as well. But do you think there was always a problem with Vote Leave being too linked to the Tory party?
I think in the end, it was natural that political parties would be represented in an unofficial sense. I mean, when I say represented, would be present in the campaigns to leave the European Union. One of the interesting crossover and cutover. I'm a Tory. I'm on the Conservative candidates list. I sought to get selected for a seat at the last election. I've campaigned for the Tories election after election. One of the criticisms that I've received was that in the coalition that we had put together that applied for designation to the Electoral Commission, one of the parties rolled up underneath my platform was UKIP, and people resented the presence of UKIP in the course of doing that. And I actually happen to think that Nigel Farage, who's won under two different party banners, two national elections, European elections in 2014 and 2019, I think Nigel Farage is one of the great heroes of the Brexit movement. We would never have got to Brexit without him. Nevertheless, my point is, I was criticised in my kind of coalition for having UKIP on board, which I thought was ironic because we had a couple of communist parties on the platform as well, and they seemed to attract or elicit far less criticism. But anyway, so naturally, on the other hand, Vote Leave got criticised for having the Conservatives. And I suppose it's a long answer and a long way round of saying it's part of the course. You're going to get criticised for whatever party that you have on board and for whatever presence you have under your banner. I really respect the guys at Vote Leave. I thought they ran a great campaign. I was delighted when, well, of course I was delighted, I wanted us to leave the EU, but I was delighted that they succeeded and that they delivered on the mandate. So I was completely comfortable rowing in behind them once I lost the electoral designation and they won. Yeah. And in the same way, I hope that the country is completely happy, given that we are now in a post-Theresa May leadership, seeing lots of the people from Vote Leave in number 10 rowing in behind them in leading our country. It's not the circumstances they wanted or expected given coronavirus. Nevertheless, I think they are great leaders, and I'm really pleased to see they are where they are.
Yeah, I mean, you've been involved in the Eurosceptic movement, the pro-Brexit movement, quite a while. Yeah. And what was it? Which kind of argument was it that was for you was most powerful personally?
Oh, sovereignty. The ability to make decisions for our country and to govern ourselves. That a country that cannot do that, it doesn't meaningfully control its own course, destiny, or future. There are, of course, other people. I mean, I'm quite relaxed about freedom of movement, so long as we have genuine control over our borders. There are other people who took a very different perspective on the question of migration and freedom of movement. But we needed that coalition between more freedom-minded people and more immigration control-minded people, between people who cared more about sovereignty or cared more, for argument's sake, about contributions to the European Union as a percentage of budget. You know, we needed that broad coalition in the same way that the Remain campaign was a broad mix of people motivated by different reasons from different positions. But for me, by miles, the most important argument is sovereignty, the ability to control our own laws, pass our own laws, and seek to govern in determination of our own future. The point for me, James, is that those making decisions on behalf of our country should make it in our country's interests, and only and solely in our country's interests. The European Union plainly doesn't do that and shouldn't do that. The European Union has to judge and govern and direct, in as much as it does those things, on behalf of 28 different countries, of which the UK will be a part, but by no means a significant or and certainly not majority or dominant voice. I would rather decision makers made decisions for our country in 100% and only the UK's interests, rather than having to dilute that across 27 other countries. And I also think it's worth bearing in mind that countries have the right, in my view, to make decisions and make mistakes. So some people will say, oh, yeah, you say sovereignty, but that means that's the freedom to make. And then they say something they disagree with and assume you disagree with. Or to do that, something they disagree with and assume you disagree with. To which my point is always, yes, we may as a country get some decisions wrong, but we still have the right to make those decisions ourselves. So we have the right to make decisions that even you as an individual might judge to be in error. We have the right to do that. And if the EU sometimes gets it right, pragmatically, it doesn't mean that it's right in principle that they govern us.
Yeah. Now, I guess partly as a result of Brexit, one of the things that happened in the last election, what was really interesting, is that the Conservative voter base became more working class than previously. So I think both the YouGov polling and the Lord Ashcroft polling suggest that the Conservatives actually took a higher proportion of the working class vote than Labour, and Labour took a higher proportion of the middle class vote than the working class, which I think is the first time both those two things have happened. But how do you think that's going to change the party? And how do you think it should change the party?
I think it's really going to depend on the next election, because a big part of the next election will be determined by trying to hang on to seats that were won for the first time at the last election. And so the first big change will be that's where a lot of the effort's going to go. But the reason I say it will depend on the next election is that if those seats prove to be sticky, if they prove to be seats the Conservative Party can hang on to, then I think we really will see a potential sea change in the a direction of travel the Conservative Party takes. If it turns out they were one-hit wonders, if it turns out the Conservative Party in normal times cannot hang on to those seats, can't in the absence of Jeremy Corbyn, can't in the absence of a stymied Brexit vote, can't in the circumstance of the time whilst led by a charismatic Boris Johnson and so forth in that environment, they can't win those seats again, then it may revert somewhat more to business as usual. And so that's why I think the next election is going to be a big determinant of that. So I think a lot of people think the jury's out on your question about how this changes things, and they want to see whether the Conservative Party can hang on to those seats before actually really forming a judgment, or letting themselves think that this is the new normal, that in the medium term the Conservative Party has to appeal to this much broader base of voters, of which the working class is a much bigger part in times to come.
I mean, there are some people that seem to sort of associate this with economic factors becoming less important in our politics, and perhaps the cultural cleavage almost overtaking it. So issues of sovereignty and immigration and culture becoming more important than traditional issues of working class, middle class. I mean, do you think there's anything to that?
Yes, I think the biggest thing that's to that is the fact that there isn't right now a party that's in favour of a small state and low taxes, and that would be that's always my political instinct. It's no criticism of the party to which I belong that that's not the case right now, because of course our government is doing things that are on an extraordinary footing we wouldn't see in peacetime. This is basically wartime economic management, bloating out the state to try to defeat a challenge that we face, and the government's doing the right thing in that. I do think, by the way, Jeremy Corbyn was singularly graceless in the manner of his departure, not offering any kind of sense of coming together or community or cohesion or acknowledging the government had done anything, as it mounted an enormous and quite Keynesian and left-wing budgetary approach to this crisis. The reason I say all that, though, is that I hope in times to come we can get back towards being a tax-cutting, smaller state party. But for the time being, there's far less economic argument between the parties than there has been in the past. So, of course, we see economics and money issues playing less of an issue because there's less of a debate between the main parties about the future of the state, about how much of a percentage of state spending it should be, about how much we should fund our health service and so forth. These used to be really big political divides and arguments. And right now, there's basically, whilst there's all manner of personal snarling and unpleasantness, in policy terms, there's broad consensus. So no wonder we see less political focus on it and more focus on other things.
Yeah. I mean, if I was to kind of sum up British politics over the last 4 years, I guess the two key things would obviously be A, Brexit, and B, the radicalism of the left, the kind of the Corbyn movement, and just how extreme some of it came by kind of traditional British standards. So having a shadow chancellor who praised the bravery of a terrorist group that used to bomb the country he wanted to manage.
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think the British left, or at least a section of British left, became so radical? And why did the centre left still sort of tolerate that?
So other people have different views on this, but I don't actually think that British politics has been particularly changed by Corbyn. I'm not one of the people who thinks that Corbyn has dragged the political compass significantly to the left. So that informs my answer to your question, because I think that what Corbyn has done is to test to destruction the point that his politics and his principles are unelectable. I think that what the Corbyn leadership has done at a national level, and it's a heck of a way to conduct an experiment, is to find out whether people would vote for policies this left wing, is to find out if people would say, I support a shadow chancellor who says he wants to nationalise water, rail, electricity, power, gas, utilities and so forth, post office. Is the country going to vote for that? And they tested it twice, and the answer is but now I think we're much more likely to see a reversion towards a more kind of mainstream, for argument's sake, proto-Blairite position. So the question for me isn't why were they so radicalised, because Corbyn has been true to those views his entire life. One thing you do have to give him is consistency. He and McDonnell and co have stuck to those views. It's just that in that cycle of Labour politics and through a couple of accidents and errors, they became the leadership cohort for a while and hung on to it. They haven't profoundly changed their party. They haven't profoundly changed the left. They got an opportunity to take long-standing left-wing views and for a short period of time put them in their focus because they became the party's policies. Now they're not going to be anymore, and I imagine they'll sink back to the obscurity from whence they came, and to which I think many will say they deserve to go.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I found quite interesting is the extent to which the centre-left, I mean, obviously the centre-left weren't happy about it. They did try to overthrow Corbyn after the Brexit result. But when push came to shove in December, I mean, they still advocated voting Labour. I mean, all the kind of moderate Labour MPs said, let's make Corbyn Prime Minister despite the anti-Semitism, despite links to terrorist groups and so on. And that was one thing I found really interesting. I wasn't entirely sure why. I mean, it's kind of an interesting parallel in UKIP, but when UKIP went very far to the right under Gerard Batten, all their MPs left. Whereas under Labour went very far to the left, and all their MPs, minor handful of exceptions were made. I was wondering, why do you think it was that the centre left were prepared to tolerate it? Do you think it was anger about Brexit? I mean, they were so determined to overturn Brexit, any tools available would do? Or do you think it's something deeper?
I think it's actually that they want to own the Labour brand. They want to own the brand and they want to own the party machinery. They realise, rightly in my view, that there is value in the Labour brand and that there is value in having an on-the-ground machine that can get out and deliver votes. The difficulty with their position is first of all, that machinery is changing fast. So a lot of it is effectively now the momentum machine, which has come in, and the Australian political system has a term for this. They call it white anting. So white ants come in and eat your house from inside. Termites come and eat it out. And that's what momentum has done for lots of the Labour branches. And the second reason that there are shortcomings to that logic about owning the brand is that Corbyn himself tarnished the brand, most especially over anti-Semitism. And so therefore association with that brand whilst he was leader was negative. Some people left, but not as many as you might have expected in those circumstances. And now, I find myself, I live in Southwark, so my member of parliament is Neil Coyle, who tweeted this week how delighted he was to see the back of Jeremy Corbyn, the worst leader the Labour Party's ever had, who should have gone years ago, to which I thought, but you campaigned for him to be Prime Minister at 2 elections, and you happily remained a member of the Labour Party and an MP taking the Labour whip. The hypocrisy is quite extraordinary. But in the end, it is, as I say, I think it's because they wanted to own the brand and they wanted to own that machinery on the ground. So in my local example, Southwark's a one-party state now. The Labour Party runs it everywhere. You want to have that membership of hundreds. You want to have those ward committees. You want to have that power of the people getting out and delivering. And if you have to wait out Corbyn before it becomes yours again, which is the logic I think people like Neil Coyle have pursued, then it's worth doing.
Yeah. There's one final question. Now, obviously, it's a kind of slightly depressing time with the virus, but I'll end on an optimistic note. Going forward, what do you think is the main opportunity for Britain with Brexit once the virus situation is contained?
The best thing for the UK is to get away from some of the failing economies that we see in the EU. Now, in principle, my point is I want us to govern ourselves on a sovereign basis. So even if the UK were poorer as a result of leaving the EU, or if we were poorer than the EU average, I would still want us to leave. I'm not somebody that thinks that we should get in if economically it's better for us. But my point is, I think it's unarguably better for us in economic terms to leave anyway. I would want to leave even if we were going to be poorer, but I think it's unarguable we're going to be better off governing for ourselves and making trade deals on our own behalf. Consider this: the European Union has never included services in a trade deal with a third country. Now, what's the UK best at? Services. The EU hasn't even completed a single market in services. So no wonder, given they look at something and think what's the UK best at, don't prioritise it. Now imagine to yourself that for a moment, heaven forbid, that we'd voted to remain. Do you think, having defeated the Eurosceptic movement in the UK, the EU would suddenly prioritise the UK's interests and put our interests front and centre in a trade deal? I don't. So I think it's far more likely we see trade arrangements prioritised to reflect our own interests, services especially, once we're in charge of our own trade policy. So that's the positive. And then the negative that we avoid is the huge debt being accumulated in the EU and having it hung around our necks. This is not me taking advantage of a coronavirus point. It's been true for a very long time. If you consider the countries of the European Union on a spectrum where Greece is already well off the end of the table, but there are lots of countries that aren't that far behind them. The state of the Italian economy with their many busted and small banks, many of which should have gone to the wall, but for political interests keeping them going. The Spanish and the French and their debt to GDP ratios. You open your GCSE O-level economics textbook, and it says these countries are in a classic debt trap. Debt is so large that their GDP can never grow to catch up to pay it off. What should you do? Turn the page to the answer for O-level. Devalue? Deflate? They can't, because they're in a common currency. And they're in a common currency which dictates their interests not on an economic basis, but on a political one. That's why Greeks, who plainly should have never joined the euro in the first place, because they joined on a lie about the state of their economy, should have been kicked out of the euro as soon as what was happening in Greece became obvious. And instead they were left there to suffer year on year, schools closing, hospitals closing, and so forth, because the project is political, not economic. Well, if they want to carry on down that road, they can, but it's not for us. So both for the positive trading reasons that I identify and for the avoidance of the incredibly growing debt that we're talking about in the EU, which in the end will go off like a bomb, the country concerned, then the next ring will be the country's in an economic union with them, then the next ring will be the country's not in an economic union but in a political union with them, and the next ring being everyone else. I'd like to move us as far away from that explosion as possible. And in the end, you can't run away from debt this high. Nobody can bail out the Italians. The economy's too big. There are too many economies at risk. In the end, one of these Eurozone economies is going to fall over. When it happens, I'd like us to be as far away as possible. Sorry, you asked for a cheery note, and I gave you a
No, it was very interesting, though. No, thanks a lot for your time. I mean, this is the perfect time to finish because the screen's just frozen. So, I don't know if you can still. Oh, that's better. I'm going to say thanks a lot for your time. That was really interesting.
Thanks, James.